All right, everyone. Welcome to another week of the Big 12 podcast. This is still Coach DangerZoneh of the TCU Horned Frogs.
Coach HAFFnHAFF, Kansas State.
And we're here to bring you a special segment. We polled the Big 12 coaches on what questions they like to be answered, and we really have two that we're going to go for. The first was posed by Ace Wolf, and we'll ask this, so you can answer first. He asked, ass or titties?
I'm answering first.
Yeah, you go first.
I'm an up top guy.
Yeah, I have to say the same. I think there's a lot of ass men out there, but I'll say up top. Let's go titties. But the real question we're going to be answering here, if you had to build a team from each different positional group, so we have quarterbacks, backfield, wide receivers, tight ends, offensive line, defensive line, linebackers, corners, safeties, and special teams. You get one unit from each Big 12 team. How would you build it? So the way we did that, me and Haff each built our own team, and we're going to go through our picks and kind of explain and show you why we did this. It was a fun exercise. You kind of got to balance out where you put different teams, where team strength lied, and sometimes mitigating where they needed to play. So I guess we have to start at the top. You going to go quarterbacks?
Go quarterbacks.
All right, you go first.
All right, so for quarterbacks, this was one of the easiest ones for me. Mohamed Foster is the best quarterback in the league, by far best player at the most important position. So I had to go West Virginia. I thought about putting Raheem, the interception machine, in there just because he's my boy. And I'm going to have to plug Kansas State in somewhere. But for the sake of this team actually good on the field, not just in their mind, I had to go with West Virginia.
Yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from. And I agree. Mohamed Foster is the best quarterback in the conference. But I think West Virginia has a lot of positions that are the best in the conference. And I think Oklahoma State has a great quarterback of their own. I actually went with Chester Brenner right here from the Oklahoma State Cowboys. He has 12 touchdowns to 3 interceptions this season, is completing 68% of his passes. He's not a big ground threat. He's a pocket passer compared to Foster, but I think he's going to provide a lot through the air. I think he's going to be able to distribute the ball to some of the wide receivers and targets that he'll have. But I definitely think that, again, Foster would be the best option here. But this is one of the places from the very start where you kind of cut corners to find a slightly less player to put in there, to put some other options in there. So anyone else you consider for this? I think these two kind of are the top tier of the Big 12. Maybe Christian Graham, but even he hasn't had a great season relative to these two.
Yeah, if I'm building a team for the future, I would take Christian Graham, but redshirt freshman, a lot of struggles there. And if we're talking about a team to win right now, I think it has to be Foster or Brenner. And I thought about Brenner, but I couldn't get away from Foster. Got to take the 5-star for quarterback.
Yeah, for sure. Foster's an excellent quarterback. He's been having a great season. And Brenner still has some questions about level of talent that he's playing against and how he'll continue to do. But I do like the choices so far. Next, we move to the backfield, which has fullback and running back. And this one we had the same choice on, I believe.
Yeah, there's not really a lot of different ways to go on this one. You got Solomon McLaughlin having a great year at Texas Tech. But again, taking a guy for the future, that's who I would take. But you've got to go with OU here. You got Maurice White is having a phenomenal year. They've got the best fullback in the league, so the highest rated running back and fullback. And beyond that, they really don't rate well at any other position. So kind of plug them in at their strength and knock them off the board.
Yeah, for sure. This was the easiest pick, I think, out of all of this. I think this is where everyone starts their list, was by putting Oklahoma as the backfield, because I'm not sure what else you're going to do with them. I mean, they have a stud running back in Maurice White. So far this season, he has 99 carries for 504 yards and 5 touchdowns. He's second in the conference in rushing behind Solomon McLaughlin, but also on 11 fewer carries. He has the highest yards per carry. He's the only one above 5 in the conference right now, I believe. That's on the quarterback. And he's having an excellent season. So I think all of that together and the fact that what else are you going to do with Oklahoma, especially when there are other options for Texas Tech. They have a couple other positions where they're good at. Then you also have a guy like Simeon Wells who is having a good season, almost 5 yards per carry, but is still not as good as Maurice White. So you get the best position, the best player at the position with not too much to worry about in regards to other players. Unfortunately for Coach Chicago Ted.
Yeah, that one's pretty easy lock. That, like you said, that's the first one I put down. And, not all of the teams that rate lowly at a lot of positions were easy to place, but that was easy for me.
Yeah, I think part of that goes to the fact that Ted spent a long time recruiting like 2 or 3 star players each year. So he has those studs, guys like that. But when you have people like Graham Burnett declare early, you can't always use those stars. So that's kind of what the problem Oklahoma's run into this year and just in general. But they still have Maurice White, who's a bona fide stud. All right. Now this is where I think it starts to get fun. Next position is the wide receiver core.
Who'd you put at wide receiver?
I chose the West Virginia Mountaineers. So that's why I ended up not putting Muhammad Foster at quarterback, because I think in this conference, the single best playmaker is J.C. Weldon. I think J.C. Weldon is more of a game changer on that West Virginia offense than Muhammad Foster. I think he's a guy who can come in, especially with a pocket quarterback like Brenner, and change the game. I think he's a guy that will play with most any quarterbacks. And I know Malcolm Davis at Kansas is really good. And I know there are a couple other really good wide receivers in this conference, but I think J.C. Weldon's on another level, which is why I chose the West Virginia Mountaineers. And they also have depth there too. They have a guy – I'm trying to find it right here. Let's see. They have, say, Elias Langston's pretty good. He's not having the best of seasons. But then again, West Virginia doesn't throw a lot. Not Hayden Dyer plays for another one, or Stephen Hager. They have some depth there, even though I think he's a tight end, actually. I'm just looking at the receivers list right now. How about your pick, though?
So I had to go with my in-state foes, the Kansas Jayhawks. This one's a real close between Kansas and West Virginia. In fact, they're both number 1s are 5-star receivers. Both number 2s are 4-star, but Kansas gets a little bit of an edge in the slot. So Kansas has Malcolm Davis, Chris Burgos. They've combined for over 500 yards and 5 touchdowns this season. And then they've got Timmy Sutton as their little speed guy in the slot. And I'm not actually seeing stats for him. I might be missing that. Mm-hmm. But they also have a stud tight end, so maybe he's not getting many chances either. But he essentially was the reason I went with Kansas over West Virginia, which allowed me to plug Foster in at my quarterback position.
Yeah, I think that's a good option. I think it's very tight who has the better wide receivers between those two groups. I think you have arguments for both of them. I think at the top, it's kind of hard to say that Malcolm Davis is better than J.C. Weldon, even though I'm sure Storm will come out with some stats to make that argument. But in the end, I think there weren't a ton of options. But outside of those two, I think the wide receiver depth in this conference is below average outside of those two for sure.
Storm will have some stat like on games played on Friday nights in the state of Texas where it's 70 to 75 degrees.
Oh, yeah.
Davis is the best receiver in college football.
Oh, he's like the ESPN random stats of CFPHC, which is awesome.
Did you ever watch the movie Little Big League?
Mm-hmm.
I loved all the random stats they came up with. That's how I feel about Storm with his stats. They're awesome.
That's about what you get from him. All right. Before speaking of the Kansas Jayhawks, though, that's actually where I'm going to go with this next position because we're going to tight ends now. And I think the Kansas Jayhawks not only have the best tight end in the conference, they have the best tight end in the country in Noah Hills. He, so far this season, is playing excellent. It's his junior year. He still has another one left if he doesn't declare, even though I think there's some expectations he will. He has 16 catches for 293 yards and 3 touchdowns in only 4 games. He's leading the team in receiving. That's with Malcolm Davis there. And I think having him there as another weapon on my offense for Chester Brenner make things very, very tough for whatever defense faces them.
All right, so I'm going to go to the state of Texas. I'm going to take Baylor for my tight end. As I looked across it, there's actually 3 teams in the Big 12 that have a 5-star tight end. You've got Baylor, Texas, and Kansas. I couldn't use Kansas. I already used them as wide receivers, and I think there's a very obvious place to plug in Texas that we both agree on we'll get to later. And so that left me with Baylor. And I kind of looked at tight ends too deep because there was all a tie across the board at the first. I ended up picking the team with the worst second tight end. So Baylor has Coffee Moore as their number 2 tight end. He's like a 1-star skill guy. But again, I don't think this team's going to roll out 2 tight end sets very often. So Baylor's tight end, Haston Ryder, has 259 yards and 3 touchdowns. Just a little bit behind Kansas's tight end in terms of yardage with equal touchdowns. Of course, Baylor puts up like 80 points a game and gives up 80 points a game.
80 points a game. They're letting people throw all over them, but they throw just as much.
Playing basketball on grass and at Baylor, but hey, it works kind of sometimes. So
it's been okay so far.
For tight end.
Oh, I like that choice. The only other choice I think would be in the conference you were talking about earlier is Texas with Stephen Maloney, the guy who came in and was so good as I think a sophomore that he made the reigning national championship MVP transfer. If that says anything about him. That Will Hawley, after leading Texas to a national championship and being the MVP, transferred to UTEP because Stephen Maloney was going to take his job. And he's having an excellent season too, 19 catches for 227 yards and 3 touchdowns. And again, he's another one that it's hard not to choose, especially when they have solid backup behind him. But again, there's some other positions where Texas has some serious talent, and we'll get to those. Texas is actually, more than I realized before doing this, is stacked pretty far across the board. A much better team than I thought they did before this season. I'm a lot higher on the Longhorns now. All right. So that's our tight ends. Yeah, I don't think there's any other really notable tight ends. We have some solid ones at Iowa State or that's really about it. My guy, Kana Tagada, is not even close to the conversation with the other ones. West Virginia has an all right guy, but it really is a tier of their own with those 3. And next, another position we agree on is the offensive line.
Yeah, so when you come to the offensive line, there's 2 teams in the conference that you just have to find a place to stick, and that's Iowa State and Kansas State. And surprisingly, I wouldn't have guessed this, but Iowa State actually has a pretty solid offensive line. I rated them out as the 4th best in the league. So there's 3 units that were better than them, and I had that as – let's see. I have Kansas as the best offensive line. TCU is number 2. OSU is number 3. And then Iowa State is number 4. But this is the one place that Iowa State graded out much higher than anywhere else. It was a chance for them to actually contribute. And honestly, looking at it, their line's not that far off of those other 3 that I mentioned. They've got Daniil Norris, who is a 2-star skill but 5-star potential guy. He's kind of an up-and-comer. But the interior of their line's really solid. They're a little weak at left tackle, although their 3.5-star guy there is like on par with all of my starters. But the strength of their line's in the interior, and they've got an up-and-coming star on the right tackle position.
Yeah, it's only a freshman they have, or redshirt freshman they have on that right side, I believe. And no, they have two studs at center and right guard. So even though that freshman is kind of struggling right now just because he's young, he's getting valuable starts, but he has veterans beside him helping him. And across the board, there's no real position that you can say none of these players are good or don't have talent. This Iowa State team has its problems, but those problems are not on the offensive line. Across the board, they have solid guys. Even on the left side, both guys can hold their own, especially in this conference. You have 3.5 stars who can keep up with the entire conference, with the defensive lines of the conference. And that's really where Iowa State's going to make their money. And it's where the best part of their team is, part of where they kind of need to build around. And we'll see how they do that in the future. And it kind of helps that outside of that, where are you going to put Iowa State?
Yeah, that always makes it a little bit easier.
So I think that was one of the easier picks when you're looking at it, looking at who we've already kind of gone through, looking at the easier choices to put Iowa State there in a place where they fit well and have a good team there too. All right, so other offensive lines, though, just to talk about some of the other teams in the conference there, I think this is another position where Kansas is the best. Kansas has some studs along the offensive line. They also have some places where they struggle. They have a star left tackle, even though it is Ben Good. Ben Good's still there. I just remember seeing the draft players but it is Ben Good there at left tackle, who wasn't as good as expected going into the draft, but he's still a star player. He was one of the top players out of high school and has been a 4-year starter for Kansas. You also have, across the rest of the line, just solid players. And then same thing, TCU has a solid offensive line. I have my guy Tyson Chadwick as the left tackle, who is still only a sophomore. Then you have Usame Nixon and some other guys along the line. But it's not a position where the Big 12 is at its strongest, I don't think. Or it's another position where there's a tier above the rest, and then there's a lot of average guys. I think we've seen that trend a lot so far with this conference.
Yeah, and that makes it easy to plug some of these in. But then as you get closer to the bottom of the list and you're trying to figure out who to put at corners and safeties, it's starting to get a lot more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is, especially when you run out of teams.
Yeah, as I made my list, I started to plug in some of the stars that I knew had to be where they were going to be. And then I had to reshuffle that list like 8 times because I got to the bottom and would have like four units from one team. It was an interesting exercise.
Yeah, it was, because there are a lot of places where on the offense you'd want to use like just West Virginia and Kansas for half the offense, and then Oklahoma in the backfield. Or on defensive line, you realize there's no way you can use Hudson Adams on your defensive line because you have 3 different positions where you'd rather have West Virginia at.
Which is interesting because when I think of high-flying Big 12 offenses, I immediately think of Baylor, not really Kansas and West Virginia, but Kansas and West Virginia definitely top out the offensive talent.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't even have Baylor on offense right now.
Yeah, I don't either.
Wow, we're done with the offense. No, you had tight end.
Tight end, that's right.
But yeah, I don't have Baylor on the offensive side, and I don't have him at defensive line either, if you all were wondering, and that's our next option. Next question.
So who do you have at defensive line?
I have the University of Texas Longhorns because they have a consistent defensive line. Top to bottom are a solid group. They have – here, I can pull it up.
They've got Stephen High and Zahir Rouse on the edge. Mm-hmm. 4-star and a 4.5 – or they're both 4 stars. And then Jamal Robinson, a defensive tackle, which he's a 4.5. And here's the question. When you set this team up, are you running 4-3 or 3-4?
See, when I set my team up, I want to run a 4-3 because of especially because of who I have as my linebacker position. So that's why I'm going to end up running. And Texas probably isn't the best defensive line for a 4-3. But they can still run it. They still have guys in those positions, especially 2 defensive tackles who can play it. So I'd like Jamal Robinson alongside Evan Wieniz on the defensive line, especially with both of them as freshmen. Jamal Robinson is a 4.5-star redshirt freshman. He is insane. That's actually crazy. He's one of the best players in recruiting last year or 2 years ago, redshirted and reached his full potential. So it's going to be crazy to see what he can do with 4 years of being a full potential guy.
Well, hopefully 3. Hopefully he'll get there early.
Hopefully for the conference it's 3 because he's going to break some – he's looking at like Jeremy Miller records, like some crazy ones. And they have defensive ends along there. And it helps that the linebackers I chose wouldn't work great in a 3-4. So yes. I'm gonna run this team in a 4-3. You have a 1-gap guy alongside a 2-gap guy, so they can kind of eagle 4-3.
Yeah.
So you have Jamal Robinson lining up in a 1 gap, and then Winnie's in a 2-gap right on top of probably the offensive guard, and then you have High and Rouse along the outside.
So when you look at defensive line, obviously the disclaimer is that Hudson Adams is the best guy in the league.
Yeah.
5-star defensive tackle. He's tied with Maxim Hillman for Baylor with the most sacks on the year for the conference.
Yeah.
But like you said, you can't pick West Virginia. There's too many other positions. So I also went with Texas. High has 1.5 sacks on the year. Jamal Robinson has 2.5 sacks on the year already. So he's already pushing it. Hudson Adams to try to catch up there. This is a place I thought about plugging in Kansas State. We have Matthew Mayfield and Javier Tovar as both 4-star defensive ends on the edge. But there was way too big of a drop-off at defensive tackle. And overall, Texas just has a phenomenal defensive line. And so I had to plug them in there. I will say Texas Tech was a really close second for me. I almost plugged Texas Tech's defensive line in, but I had to put them somewhere else.
Yeah, I think Texas Tech has the best player at one position in the conference, and I think we'll see that later. But it was hard not putting Hudson Adams in there because if we talk about playmakers in the Big 12, I said J.C. Weldon is the biggest playmaker in the Big 12. That might just be on the offensive side of the ball. You can make an argument that Hudson Adams is a game changer for any defense in the Big 12 because he's going to come in. He's going to get – I think last season he had 11 sacks or something along those lines.
Yeah, it was something crazy.
Yeah, no, he had a crazy season. He's still having a crazy season. But each time he comes in, he's a guy who's going to disrupt the passer. He is first-round draft pick for sure. In this draft, he's looking like a top 10 pick.
Last year, he had 45 tackles and 12 sacks from the defensive tackle position.
That's something you just don't see. Like, what's the conference record for sacks from a defensive tackle? I'm going to look it up right now. Because I know who it is. But let's see.
While you look that up, like I said, I almost went with Texas Tech. I like to build my teams around the 4-3 as well. And Texas Tech has a better second defensive tackle than Texas does. But their first defensive tackle wasn't quite as good. So I ended up going with Texas. And unlike you, I'm actually looking at it as a 3-4 setup. So when I looked at my linebackers, I looked at it more 4 deep instead of 3 deep.
That's fair.
Not ideal with a 1-gap defensive tackle, but just kind of the way it fell.
Yeah, we've discussed this. But, sometimes guys are good enough that they can play both.
Yeah.
By the way, the record is 14. In 2015, Jeremy Miller as a defensive tackle had 38 tackles and 14 sacks.
Hot take. Does Hudson Adams break the record this season?
What's he at right now?
He's got 3 sacks through 3 games.
3 sacks through 3 games.
2 of those games were against Pitt and Penn State, and he's not going to face that type of offenses. He'll face a few of those, but
and with the offensive lines in the Big 12, it's going to be interesting to see. I think he'll get close, but Texas Tech also played in the conference championship game that year. I don't believe they were a playoff team. They were just short of it in 2015. They were undefeated until they played Oklahoma, and Oklahoma ended up winning it all. But I'll say that he ends up tying it with 14 in 14 games. They play in the conference championship and play in a bowl game, and he ends up tying it. That's my hot take from this entire episode.
All right.
So we'll see if you average 1 sack a game like Miller did, which is, again, stunning.
Yeah, that's incredible, especially if, like you said, from defensive tackle.
Yeah, from the tackle, not even end. You can see that a lot from the ends, but –
all right, so moving on to linebacker. Who do you have at linebacker?
This is where I put the TCU Horned Frogs. I think TCU has top to bottom the best linebacking core in the conference, with John Kearns as the outside linebacker, a 5-star guy. You have the sophomore Elliot McElmore, who has 19 tackles and 2 interceptions in just 4 games in his sophomore year. And then, because I'm running a 4-3, the other outside linebacker, Chance Herring's also only a sophomore, but he has a couple sacks on the season. He's playing really well as well. So I like having that there. I think there's a couple other positions where I could have put TCU, all of them defensively. I don't trust any of my offense at all. But I think that's definitely the best. I think that's where TCU is going to produce the most. And I think the linebacker is where we're at our strongest.
Okay, so for me, I went a little unconventional here. I agree. TCU far and away has the best linebacker core in the Big 12. It's not close. But I had to plug OSU in somewhere. Ironically, because OSU has a lot of good units, but they were the team I struggled to find a fit for because they're good units. They've got a good quarterback, but West Virginia has Muhammad Foster. They have a good offensive line, but Iowa State's bad everywhere else, and so you have to plug them in there. And so it kind of became this battle that, like, Oklahoma State was good at several positions, but they weren't the best at any positions. And so I started to run out of places to put them. And so I pegged them as my linebacker core. They've got Trevor Orlando and Jamel Ingram on the outside. Orlando's 4.5-star. Ingram is a 3-star, which he's the weak point here. Mm-hmm. And then they've got Zach Morrison, who is a 4-star running the mic, and Adrian Connor, who is a 4-star running the will position. And so if you look at the 4 linebackers overall, because like I said earlier, I put the Texas defensive line into 3-4 for this exercise. So if you look at four positions there, 2 inside linebackers, they have a combined 15.5 stars versus TCU, who has 16 stars. Now, the potential is a lot different. TCU's got a huge edge in the potential. They've got 2 5-star potential guys, but for me, if I'm going to play 4 linebackers, that half-point skill downgrade was worth it for me to get OSU plugged in there, and I'm going to save TCU for one of the other positions.
Yeah, see, I've thought about Oklahoma State here. I think Trevor Orlando is one of the best in the conference. I think he is, even though John Kearns is there as an outside linebacker, Baylor has their own. I think Trevor Orlando is the best outside linebacker in the conference. And he's only, I just want to say a junior this year. He may even be a sophomore. He may be a true junior. Because I remember the recruiting class. He was recruited in 2018. But that would make him a true junior or a redshirt sophomore, 2017. But the point is, he's excellent, and I can see where you're coming from with Oklahoma State. But at that point, I had already taken Brenner because I thought he was the best other option from the Cowboys.
And then, like I said, Ingram is the weak point, but he does have an interception on the year, so he can make plays when he needs to.
Yeah, I think one weak point in the core doesn't kill an outside linebacker core. especially because with Daquan Darcy playing for my team, you got Gino Bohannon, you have a lot of studs. The best outside linebacker I ever had was a 3.5-star guy, which is Rayleigh Coyle.
Especially if you are going to run the 3-4, you can have a little bit of weakness at outside linebacker because they're not going to be solely in coverage. So,
yeah, especially the weak side outside linebacker, because they're not going to be even your main run stoppers or pass rushers. So you kind of neutralize that damage in 3-4.
What's interesting, you talk about thinking about plugging Oklahoma State in here, but you already had taken Brenner. That's what was interesting to me. Like I said, about 7 of these just came really easy. And then I would get it down to like the last one. I know I'm going to plug Iowa State in here, and then you have to shuffle everything around. And so eventually it's just like, I've got to stick with what I have. And Oklahoma State became my linebackers.
Yeah, that is fair. And I think our overall core, they're probably the second best in the conference.
Yeah, so I had them rated out number 2.
Yeah, it's not a huge drop-off. Of course, I'm always going to say I think my linebackers are better.
Of course.
And I think – and there's only one senior there too, so it's going to be fun to see them grow. 2 of them are sophomores on that linebacker core. So you got a couple more years to deal with that. But the rest of the conference also isn't that great. I think Texas has an incredible outside linebacker, a good core there because they have a 5-star guy. I want to say – I'm looking at his name. Oh, Jabari Fletcher, yeah. Now, Jabari Fletcher is another bona fide stud. I'm not sure his stats. I can look that up real quick. But he came out in the same class that Chance Herring did, and he was the number 1. He was like the number 1 outside linebacker recruit in the state of Texas and probably the number 1 in the nation. He was a top guy. He was a spotlight guy, and he's had a good career. I still don't think he's as good as Trevor Orlando yet, but Texas would be the only other option there, and I think they add more value on the defensive line. So I'm trying to look up where Jabari Fletcher is, stats-wise. Oh, he has 10 tackles, a sack, and interception on the season, so not bad through 4 games for Orlando. All right, now it's getting kind of tight because we're 7 picks in, and now there's only 3 left. Or there's only 3 like teams we can choose from left. So we're getting kind of tight. Next round is the cornerbacks. We actually have almost the same 3 teams left. From left to pick, I have Baylor, Texas Tech, and Kansas State. I haven't placed yet. And half you haven't placed TCU, Texas Tech, and Kansas State.
Right.
All right. So what's your next pick?
Where are you headed for cornerback?
For cornerback, I am going to Waco, Texas. And I know they have given up a lot of passing yards. They have gotten torched through the air so far this year. But this is one where I kind of had to make cuts, find the best place to put these guys. And at corner, Baylor has Kyle Cunningham, who is sometime he's going to be as good as he should be. Kyle Cunningham is a guy who should be a star, and eventually I can see him living up to that. And behind him, they don't have bad depth either. They have their next 2 guys. I'm going to pull up their depth chart so I can see that. But behind him, they have guys, again, who have struggled. Baylor, again, does not have a good pass defense, at least so far this season. Their last game, they stepped it up a bit. But they have Cunningham, and then once the depth chart loads, I'll talk about the other guys. While that happens, what was your choice?
I was going to say the irony of picking Baylor for any defensive position is not lost on me, but I guess technically if we're limiting your defensive selections to in-conference, there's really no good teams to pick from except maybe Texas Tech because we all suck at defense. But
yeah, well, yeah, our defenses have all struggled, and we've had problems with it. They also have Deshaun Tinsley, who's a 3-star guy, and William Travis, who's just a freshman out of Oklahoma but has a lot of potential there. So we'll see how he does, how this cornerback core does, but it is kind of unfortunate trying to pick the Bears for a defensive position, but I think this is, at least overall with their defense, where they're the strongest. I think they're one of the best in the conference there.
To pick up my cornerback unit, I'm going to go to Fort Worth, to TCU, which is interesting because I have TCU's corners rated number 6 in the league. And so this is the second worst overall rating that I took a group at, and we'll get to the worst one here in a few minutes. But that's largely due to the nickelback because I looked 3 deep at corner, and Corey McCrary is a 2.5-star, 3.5-star potential guy. And so he's the weak point of that, and it kind of drug that rating down. A little side note, he's actually the exact same player as my number 1 cornerback, Alex. That's okay. But if you just look at the top 2 corners, we have Roman Blackman, who's manning the 1. He's a 3.5-star out of 5-star guy. And then we have William Cooper on the opposite side. He's a 3.5-star, 4.5-star potential guy. And so you look at those 2 guys, and that's a pretty good cornerback group, especially considering where I'm going to plug some other teams in at. Because obviously, if you're going to go number 1, I have Texas Tech rated number 1 at cornerback, and they're pretty solid all the way across. But I wanted to use them somewhere else. And so if you just look at the top 2, TCU is right there with them. And considering how the team that I'm building is built, with the linebackers that they have, I'm probably going to stay in my base defense the majority of the time. I'm probably not going to get into the nickel much. Yeah. And so I really didn't want to let Corey McCrary drag that rating down because I don't think he would see the field much on this team. Now, Tech has the number 1 corner group. Like I said, they've got a 4-star and then 2 3.5 stars. So if you're looking at all 3, they're better, but I'm going to take TCU here.
How different is it if Elias Crawley doesn't transfer, the 3.5 out of 3.5 guy?
Yeah, then it's a lot easier for me just to take.
Yeah, it's another position where you want to look and say, yeah, these guys have high potential. They're really good studs and could be good, but both of them are first-year starters. And in their first few games, they've played really good quarterbacks, especially their first 3 games. Sorry to the greatest. But they played Jamel Armstrong, Eric McLean, and whoever that dude at SMU is.
No. Next Player Tribune article is going to be about you now.
Yeah, whoever that quarterback at SMU is, Andre Webb. No, but he got kind of torched by them. It was a good learning experience for their first few games. Roman Blackman had his first interception this week against Raheem. It doesn't help that Tom Wyman declared from that core either. So the fact that we're still choosing them after we lost 2 of their top 3 guys from last season is kind of fun. But it's an interesting group. I'm kind of excited to see how they do. I'm not too happy with their performances so far, which is why I kind of went another way. I can see why you choose that. Another great cornerback group, you have Kansas, who's one I'd take as an option, or Texas, who has a star, young guy coming up, and a really good stud. Nothing like their old defensive backfield of Troy Marshall and Ivory Hole and Demetrius Patterson. But they do have some stuff. Devin Braxton's just a sophomore who's going to be a great guy as well. So it's actually a position where I like a lot of the conference, but the Bears, because I think they have the best corner currently, even though he's kind of been getting torched recently.
What's interesting to me, TCU is so good at so many positions. I think I had him rated number 1 at 3 different position groups, and then I had him number 2 at a different one and number 3 at a different one. And I ended up plugging him in at the position I had him ranked number 6.
Yeah, I mean, you never know. It turns out that having highly rated players doesn't matter that much when you still can't beat the top guys you're playing against. But
you get no sympathy.
It really matters.
2 years and have no so.
But really does. It matters not where you're the best at. especially with this kind of exercise, when you have a really deep team, unless you have some bona fide stars at some player, like West Virginia had a wide receiver, or Kansas has a tight end, or Oklahoma has a running back. But when your teams with a kind of deep roster, I think Texas kind of faltered from this too. You're going to be put a little lower some of your lesser rated positions just because you can be put there without minimized damage at a lot of positions.
Yeah.
But
the closest I've come to winning a conference game was 2018, my first season, when TCU came to Manhattan. Undefeated, lost 38-35, and Martin K missed 2 field goals, and he's still rotting on my bench. He's never set foot on the field since.
Oh man, that was another Nathan Burden special. He did that year against Western Michigan too, a team they should have beaten by a lot more, but defense sold out on the run, at least against Western Michigan. It took Burden scoring 2 touchdowns in the last minute and a half to win that game, and it was a similar comeback against Kansas State.
Yeah, that was Julius Minnow's breakout game before he went terrible the next year and got benched and now redshirted behind Raheem. But I remember, I think you were like the first person to comment after those games got posted. I don't even understand this sim anymore. We won like 1 game and you were undefeated.
Yeah. You should ask Storm about being undefeated and playing Kansas State. He's had some stories about that.
Yeah. Well, and the first game I ever won, we knocked off an undefeated Houston.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't win again until the next year in our opener. We won against obviously an undefeated team, so I thought I could only beat undefeated teams. Then I realized I can just beat out of conference teams.
Yeah, we'll see. Another hot take for this, I think Kansas State wins not 1 but 2 conference games this year, at least. Hopefully 3, so we can see the storylines behind Raheem in a bowl.
Hey, if I can backdoor to a 5-7 bowl game, I'm okay with that.
I don't know how that'll apply, how the APR scores work on this game. All right, so you got 2 more positions left.
Yeah, moving on to safeties. Who do you have at safety?
I have the team who has the best safety in the conference, and that is Cameron Riley and the Texas Tech Red Raiders. Cameron Riley is incredible. He's a guy who almost ended up going to Texas, or almost ended up going to Oklahoma State. Season, Oklahoma State only really bid on 3 guys, and they went really hard on Raheem, really hard on Cameron Riley, and really hard on Afasa Nehru. They got Raheem, they got Nehru, and they were close on Cameron Riley, but the coach ended up leaving. So he just kind of said, screw that, and went to Texas Tech. But Texas Tech, he's another guy who's going to be a first-round draft pick. In 2018, his first year start, or 2017 was his first year starting. He had 11 tackles. 2018 was his breakout year. He had 50 tackles as a strong safety and 7 interceptions, 3 touchdowns. And then 2019, he wasn't as incredible. He had 14 tackles, 3 interceptions, and a touchdown, and hasn't made a stat sheet so far this season. But either way, his incredible sophomore year still gives me the idea that he's the best in the conference, and I think he's going to show that through this season and end up working his way into not just a first-round but top 15 draft pick. As far as free safety, I wasn't as keen on the Texas Tech free safety. I'm not even sure what his name is. I don't have their depth chart pulled up right now. But he is a solid guy. He's a 4-star guy who works well alongside Riley. But what it really was Cameron Riley drug this up from the dirt for me, or just from anything. He'll pull any free safety up and made it the easy option here. The only other option I think for Texas Tech was running back, and it was too easy to choose Oklahoma there.
Right. So for me, I also put Texas Tech at the safety position. Unlike you, I actually have them ranked number 2 at the safety position behind TCU. When you look at TCU's safeties, you've got Matthew Dyson and Christopher Malone, both 4.5-star guys. Malone's got 5-star potential. And then you compare it to Texas Tech. Like you said, Jameer Pendleton, Cameron Riley. Essentially, their skill's the same. TCU has a slight potential advantage. But I ended up taking Tech here. And again, it's interesting because Tech has the number 1 ranked corner group, and TCU has the number 1 ranked safety group. But I put TCU at corner and Tech at safety. Now, you could talk me into flipping those 2 units, especially if you were going to run a nickel defense. I think you would definitely want to flip them because Tech has a much better nickel back. But I like Cameron Riley. I like the 5-star playmaker at strong safety, and so that pushed it over the top for me. And I also went Tech at safety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that choice because that's the same one I made. But I like having TCU ranked highly too. That's the one, besides my linebackers, that's where I'm really proud of on my defense. Because these are guys who this is their 3rd year playing alongside each other in the safety position, and hopefully they'll have 1 more year next to each other. Dyson already has 2 interceptions this season in the last 2 games. Christopher Malone is kind of hit or miss. He'll come along every once in a while with like a 2 interception game, but doesn't make a ton of stat lines. But I definitely see where you could have chosen that one. Outside of that, on safety, there's not a ton of options in the conference. I think we've been seeing this trend where you have a couple, like 2 or 3 teams in the conference who are incredible at one position, and then a bunch of teams who are kind of average. You have West Virginia, who has a good free safety, is okay at strong safety. You have Kansas, who has solid players at both, but they're both kind of young and they're not too tested yet. Same thing with Baylor. You have some high potential guys there. Even Kansas State has 2 solid guys, 2 guys who know what they're doing, are going to hold their own in the secondary, but aren't really playmakers. They're guys who you wouldn't hate to have back there, but they're not going to change a game. So I think you're going to have a lot of that kind of second tier in the conference, and it's just kind of a big mess. And when you mix that all together in one conference, you just have an entire conference who's a mess, and that's still being sorted out. So it's going to be really fun to see. It kind of leads from talking about these positions, talking about the conference, but it's going to be see how that plays out.
Yeah, Ahmad Winston's my free safety. He's starting as a true freshman, 3.5-star potential, but 3-star skill guy. Fortunately, I landed him, and he started day 1. First game of the season, got a pick 6, ended up knocking off Randy. So I was pretty excited about him, and I don't think he's made a stat sheet since. So now we talk about that there's like an elite unit and then a lot of middle of the pack. You think a lot of that's because so many teams, like half the conference is Texas, and so you're sharing the same recruit pool. What do you think causes that? Or just different focuses for different teams?
I think a lot of teams focus on different positions. I think in this conference, I think it's kind of just a down year in general for the conference. I think you still have your stars who have stayed here. I think players have declared early, so a lot of the positions or teams that had a lot of stars don't have those stars, especially Oklahoma has seen a lot of guys declare early. I think there's just some bad teams in the conference that – or at least are having pretty bad down years. I think Iowa State's one of those teams that's just on a dip this year, who's at all positions are in kind of that middle area. I think Kansas State's a team that's getting better and is still kind of at most positions floating around that middle area. And then outside of that, it's just really hard to keep a top tier at every position. So you'll have a few guys who are good at 1 or 2 positions, and since they're all in Texas, they can't all be good at the same position. So it'll just kind of rotate around who's good at where. I think especially if you look at just comparing the Texas schools, no 2 of them are really stars at the same position.
Right. So we move on to the last one. We both have the same team left, but for special teams, I plugged in Kansas State because we really suck everywhere else too. I had us rated as the 9th kicker and punter combination with Frank Carney and 3-star kicker, and Leon Payne's a 3-star punter. But I really just figured that with this team, we're not going to kick many field goals and we're not going to punt very much. So it was the least impactful position. So I just plugged us in there to get it out of the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's about what I did. That's when I got to the end, and it was Kansas State who was left. Again, like, it feels kind of bad. I wish they had like a really good kicker and punter, so you could put them in at the end, and you're saying that's because that's where they make their biggest difference. But it's kind of where they're going to do the least amount of damage, which is unfortunate because Kansas State does have some good positions. They're good at wide receiver. I think Raheem's a good quarterback. I think their pass defense has been pretty good for most of the year. I think they struggled last game. But or even at fullback, they're solid. There's a lot of positions where they're a good team that can make an impact, but it's a conference that has better players who can make a better impact there, and you can't really choose that option for them.
Yeah, I think it easily shows the mentality behind my rebuilding of the team. When I came in, we had Dylan Stewart and Gary Richardson, and that was about it. Which that was awesome. That was a lot of fun, even though we lost every game but one. But the team was so there everywhere else that it really became a recruit depth before star power. And so that's still where we're at. Like you said, we're kind of getting to the middle of the pack everywhere, which is good. But we still got a couple years of rebuilding to do.
Mm-hmm.
So here's some interesting numbers for you. So like I said, I went through and I rated each position group where they stand in the conference, so I could start making the ratings. And there's nothing scientific about these, but I went then and averaged all of those position groups together. So I'm going to read those off real quick. So the highest rated team was Kansas State, was Kansas.
Yeah,
that would be biased, that's for sure. Was Kansas. Their position groups averaged out to a rating of 3.2. And so out of 10, 1 being the best, 10 being the worst, their average rating for a position group was 3.2. Then next we had the University of Texas at 4.3. Then Texas Tech at 4.8. And then Baylor at 4.9. TCU at 5. And we had West Virginia as a 5.2. OSU is a 6.2. OU is 6.5, and then Kansas State rounds out the bottom with the average rating. I skipped. Iowa State's at 6.8, and then Kansas State rounds out the bottom with the average position group rating of 7.3. Yeah. Obviously, there's not any weighting in that for different positions. Fullback was rated the same as quarterback.
Yeah, there's a lot of unscientific stuff there, but I like the kind of just look at overall which teams are the strongest. It also gives you an idea of like where some teams are kind of struggling, or just looking down the list at what they're rated, which positions are more important, where some teams are kind of struggling and stuff along those lines. But some ratings I disagree with, which was it just based on like average skill of these positions?
Yeah, for the most part, I did. I factored in their actual skill and then kind of use position or potential as a tiebreaker, since I was building the team just for like a game today. And given like a half a point skill difference, I would factor in potential. But other than that, I pretty much went straight skill.
I like the decisions here, but it kind of shows where teams lie in the conference now. And it's going to be fun to see. I think this was a fun exercise. I got a great look at each of the teams in the conference, how they're built, and not just where we can attack when we're playing them on defense, but where their strengths are, and kind of almost a different approach that each team takes at team building. Because you have Texas, who's building up a great defensive line, not as good offensive line, but they have a strong running back. Or you have Iowa State, who is a great offensive line, but everywhere else kind of struggles. So when you rebuild, where are you going to start from and where are you going to build out from?
Right. So here's the question to everybody out there. I'm going to post the rosters for each of our teams in the comments below this. And so we need to hear from you guys. In a scrimmage, does Team Danger or Team Haff win? Discount coaching, you can say Saluna coaches both teams. But which roster do you think comes out on top?
Yeah. And I'll post a poll in the thread on there so everyone can check that out as well. But about that, I think that's going to wrap us up for tonight. But one last thing we have to do, because we started way too early when we mentioned the West Virginia. So we haven't done our rendition of Country Roads yet.
You know, I actually heard that song for the first time ever on one of the podcasts that you did.
Do you know the words?
I don't. And then I actually heard it on a King of Queens episode like a day later.
All right, you might need to look up the words because we're still going to try it.
Okay, hold on. Give me a second. Smackums is going to be upset with me because we talk all the time, and he's going to be mad I don't know this song. But
no, yeah, I didn't even think about it until he mentioned it. But it's becoming a Big 12 podcast tradition. We always have to do the Country Roads rendition. So.
Okay, hold on. Okay, I think I pulled it up.
Are you ready?
Yep.
Country roads, take me home to the place I belong, West Virginia.
No.
Take me home, country roads. All right, that's it. With that ends our podcast. Thank y'all very much for watching. I think Smickens may be the only one watching right now. But to all the future Big 12ers who watch, we're out. Like I said, my name's DangerZoneh, coach of the TCU Horned Frogs.
Coach HAFFnHAFF of the Kansas State Wildcats.
Frogs.
Go Wild.